All right, everyone. Hello and welcome in. Thank you for joining me at the end of week 7 here on Monday night. We have one more game left on the schedule for the week between the Saints and the Seahawks. I will personally not be watching that game tonight because, ew, who wants to see the Saints play football, right? Having said that, the Minnesota Vikings did not participate in the NFL action this weekend. They were on the bye, and I figured, you know what, if the Minnesota Vikings get a break, so do I. So I haven't uploaded for a few days. I took the weekend off. But of course, the Minnesota Vikings couldn't keep themselves out of the headlines. They actually made a roster move over the weekend. So a few days ago, you probably have already seen this. We're going to touch base on that right now and then use the trade as a point of departure to talk about more potential trades that the Minnesota Vikings could make next week, depending on the outcome of the Dallas Cowboys game, which will take place on Sunday Night Football on Halloween night. So let's recap what happened over the weekend. The Minnesota Vikings made a trade with the Denver Broncos. They sent Stephen Weatherly over to the Broncos, a team that is starved for outside linebacker, defensive end, somewhere in that area, edge rusher. So Stephen Weatherly will now be joining the Denver Broncos, and we will get a 7th-round pick in return. We also sent a 7th-round pick with Weatherly as a package deal. So we're switching 7th-round picks between 2022 and 2023, if that makes sense. So the Minnesota Vikings decided, I guess, that they were good enough in terms of depth at the edge rusher position where Stephen Weatherly parting ways made a lot of sense. So they sent him to another destination. He will get more playing time. The Everson Griffin situation just kind of derailed any chance that Stephen Weatherly had of playing meaningful snaps for the Minnesota Vikings this year. And this also signals some good news for DJ Wanham, because it appears that they're comfortable enough with him on the roster that they would be willing to let a veteran like Stephen Weatherly go. So the Stephen Weatherly return doesn't last a full season. That experiment is now over. He didn't do well as a starter in Carolina, which is probably why he came back, because he figured he could flourish under the coaching staff that made him the desirable free agent that he was when Carolina signed him. Having said that, the Minnesota Vikings could use more help at a different position if things go well against the Dallas Cowboys for Sunday Night Football. The only other point that I want to make real quickly on the Stephen Weatherly trade is that I don't have a problem with it. It could backfire. You know, it's still a long season. This is only week 7. You know, the bye week comes a little early for the Minnesota Vikings this year. So let's just hope that everybody else can stay healthy. Everson Griffin, I have no concerns about Danielle Hunter. He looks like he's back to 100%. As far as just depth goes, it's a long season. It would be nice to have more rotational pieces, but I kind of understand why they did that. And things were made easy because the Denver Broncos general manager is a former assistant to Rick Spielman, George Payton, if you all remember him. I can't remember if it's George Payton or George Patton, whatever the one it is. That is currently who runs the front office for the Broncos, and why this trade was made much easier. So let's talk about trades that could potentially happen for the Minnesota Vikings. If things go well against the Dallas Cowboys, they win that game. They're 4-3. They look like they're going to be taking over second place in the division, which they already are now, because the Chicago Bears are just absolutely dreadful at 3-4, having been destroyed this previous week by the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So a couple players that are on the market currently, and there's many of them. I'm not going to mention all of them because we don't have a need for like an Odell Beckham Jr. or a Brandon Cooks or an Andre Dillard. Those players at those positions don't really help us right now. I'm looking at the cornerback position only for 2 reasons. Number one, it would be nice to have another corner that's under contract past this season, because I believe the only 2 currently are Cam Dantzler and maybe Harrison Hand. I'd have to double check on that. The only one I'm confident in is Cam Dantzler. Number 2, the Patrick Peterson injury is going to force him to miss 3 total games. He will not be available to return from IR until the first time we play the Green Bay Packers. So he's going to miss the Cowboys, Ravens, Chargers games. I believe it's Cowboys, Ravens, Chargers. Somebody can double check me on that. And then the fact that his injury is a hamstring, that could potentially linger for the entire season. So we may not know what version of Patrick Peterson we're going to get when he comes off IR and potentially goes up against Devontae Adams against the Green Bay Packers in his first game back from injury. So a couple players that we could potentially trade for. One of them you've probably heard of. We've probably talked about it. The other one may be flying a little bit under the radar, but it kind of relates to the Stephen Weatherly trade. The first player on the list that the Minnesota Vikings could potentially trade for is Dolphins cornerback Xavier Howard. I sent out a tweet yesterday during the NFL action when the Dolphins were losing to the Atlanta Falcons, in saying that the potential is there for the Miami Dolphins to be more likely to be willing to deal Xavier Howard in a trade prior to the November 2nd deadline if they lose this game and are at a 1-6 record. They ended up losing. They almost staged a pretty good comeback thanks to Tua Tagovailoa, who, you know, a quick opinion here, is actually playing pretty good as a starting quarterback, even though the record and the stats don't reflect it. But Xavier Howard is on the trade block, and I think the time is right to strike. The rumored compensation that they want in exchange for him is a third-round pick. I think that's something that I would be willing to do. The next player that we could potentially bring in on a trade to help the secondary would be Broncos cornerback Kyle Fuller. It makes sense because the Broncos cornerback room is pretty solid at the top with Patrick Surtain, their first-round draft pick this year, Ronald Darby, and another guy named Callahan. I think that's who is the other guy that is vying for playing time. Either way, Kyle Fuller is the odd man out. And since we've already sort of made a nice deal with the Denver Broncos, giving them Stephen Weatherly for basically nothing in return, it could be a scenario where it's like, you scratch my back, I scratch your back. Rick Spielman's like, hey, I helped you out last week. Why don't you help me out this week? Let's get a good deal in place and let us get Kyle Fuller. So that's a potential deal that could be made. So those are really the only two players that I have heard of that are on the trading block that I would be willing to target. Now, we could fantasize about all sorts of other players on other teams that are either losing or their season is over, but realistically, at the NFL trade deadline, not much happens. So I'm not going to, you know, sort of try to guess about what teams are going to be willing to separate with which player. So we'll just go with those ones that we know are currently on the trading block. Now, let's reverse the scenario. What happens if things crumble against the Dallas Cowboys? We get blown out. It's an embarrassing loss. We end up 3-4. Once again, we're tied with the Chicago Bears. Do the Minnesota Vikings look at this and say, hey, this clearly isn't going to go well. Let's offload some talent so we can start the rebuilding process early? A couple of names that could potentially be traded, and we talked about this last year after the disastrous 1-5 start that they had heading into the bye week after the Falcons game. I mentioned some players that could potentially be traded who are veterans on this roster. Kyle Rudolph was one of them. He is now gone. The remaining players that I could see potentially being traded away, number one is the easiest one that I think that they could potentially do would be Harrison Smith. Now, I am 100% against him leaving this team because he's one of my favorite players. His jersey's over there hanging in my closet. I would hate to see him go, but it would make sense to send him to a contender, a team that could potentially end up getting him a Super Bowl ring, since he can't win it here if this team does decide that it wants to end this season early. Another player that could potentially be traded away that I think Vikings fans would have no problem getting rid of would be Anthony Barr. Linebackers you don't see getting traded so much, even though one did get traded today by the St. Louis Rams. I think it was Kenny Young, something to that effect. I forget his name. But there's a lot of bizarre trades going on. Like Joe Flacco got traded to the Jets today because Zach Wilson's going to be out for 2 to 4 weeks, and they can't trust this unknown Mike White guy quarterback. So, but anyway, I digress on that. Anthony Barr is only going to be here for the rest of this season. They restructured his contract so that he could be a free agent in 2021. I don't see him sticking around past this season, so he's definitely going to another team next year. Might as well trade him, get something for him in return while you still can. And then lastly, to end this video, a potential candidate that could be traded away from the Minnesota Vikings is just me sort of speculating. But what about Alexander Madison? Now, it doesn't save you a lot of money to do this. He does have one more year left on his contract. It's a hard sell from the standpoint that Dalvin Cook does get injured more often than we would really like, and he's a very good backup. He could be a starting running back on a lot of NFL teams. And that's kind of where I got the wheels turning, because we got Kenny Nwangu coming off of IR. It does suck that we did give up, we decided to get rid of Amir Abdullah, who has been signed by the Panthers, so his services are no longer available. I believe we still have AJ Rose on the practice squad. Not that you want to be bringing up practice squad players, but I digress. The point is that he's available. And, Kenny Nwangu could be a serviceable backup for Dalvin Cook in the event that maybe he goes down. It's hard for me to sell that, but that's what I have to do to propose this trade. So where could you send Alexander Madison? Well, you could definitely send him to the Kansas City Chiefs, who are struggling in the run game, as Clyde Edwards-Helaire is really not the first round, 3-down running back that they thought he was when they drafted him, and he is currently injured. You could send him to the Baltimore Ravens, who are are handing off to Devontae Freeman and Le'Veon Bell in 2021 because they were so destroyed early in the year by injury, losing J.K. Dobbins, Gus Edwards, and they also have Latavius Murray on the roster. So I think Alexander Madison in that offense represents a much better shot at establishing a running game without just having to rely on Lamar Jackson. Maybe open up those passing lanes for Marquise Brown and Rashad Bateman. So those are my thoughts. Those are my trade ideas for the Minnesota Vikings if things go good against the Cowboys and if things go bad against the Cowboys. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Who are some players outside of maybe Xavier Howard and Kyle Fuller that you would like the Minnesota Vikings to target if things go well prior to the November 2nd trade deadline? And who are some players, if things don't go well, that you would be willing to part ways with? So let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one.